So hi, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today. My name is Mike Moffett. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation here at Smart Prosperity. And today's webinar is how to write for policymakers. I'm going to keep this webinar very brief, in part because that's one of the pieces of advice I'm going to give you today on writing for policymakers. So I've got a background, I've worked in a number of think tanks writing for policymakers, but I also was Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, housed at ISED. So I, in fact, was one of those policymakers who was reading far too much writing. So I've been on both sides of the equation. So I think that will allow me to give experience having been on both sides. So, long story short, writing for policymakers is incredibly rewarding, but comes with two big challenges. So I'm going to talk about what those two big challenges are and give you 9 tips on how to overcome them. So we have to understand, okay, why are we writing for policymakers in the first place? Because that sort of dictates how we write for them. The idea is that we're trying to provide policymakers with the information they need to make better informed decisions. So we're trying to help them make decisions. We're trying to, in part, help them sell those decisions as well, motivate those decisions, be able to communicate those decisions. But overall, again, this is an information sharing exercise. Now, policy writers, you can write a lot of different types of policy writing. Some of the policy writing you'll see will be around assessing existing or past policies. So you might have policy writing about, how effective was BC's carbon tax at reducing emissions, or, what was the effect of replacing the old manufacturer's sales tax with a GST, those kinds of things, very sort of retrospective. It could be a backgrounder about an issue. So, what is blockchain? What is AI? How is AI different than machine learning? That sort of thing. Might be backgrounders on new data or academic research. International research shows inequality worse than thought. There's an interesting StatsCan report recently that was about manufacturing job loss and the effect of employment on men. So those are some types of examples. The one I'm going to focus on, because I think it's the most interesting and the most commonly used form of policy writing, is what I would call policy prescription about an issue. So, tax reform to accelerate investment in clean tech. So the kind of thing where there's some policy problem, there's something that a government, federal, municipal, provincial, is trying to solve, and you are suggesting a potential solution for that problem. So that's what I'm going to focus on. But a lot of the advice I'm going to give is going to apply to all of these types. But that's the one in particular I'm going to focus on. So this writing form can take on many types. When you're talking about writing for policymakers, there's in fact a bunch of different types of writing we're talking about. It could be reports, briefs, government submissions, all the way down to tweets. But first, before we talk about any of that, we need to get into these two big challenges for writing for policymakers. The first is understanding your audience, and the audience of policymakers actually makes it a little bit trickier to write for. So let's compare to other potential audiences. So one audience, like academic publications, journal articles, that kind of thing. Well, in those types of publications, you can use a lot of jargon. You can be very wonkish. Because you are only writing to a group of other subject matter experts. So you can presuppose a certain level of expertise, a high level of expertise that all your readers have. So you don't need to explain the basics. You don't need to explain the terminology. You can get really heavy into jargon. On the other hand, you have mainstream media articles. So these are, you might be doing a piece for the Globe and Mail, Maclean's, Toronto Star, or what have you, that's about a certain topic, the effects of rent control on affordable housing, that kind of thing. Well, it's kind of the flip side of academic publications, because in a mainstream media article, you you should come into it with the assumption that your reader really doesn't know, anything about this. They're interested in the topic, but they don't really have any sort of deep knowledge or understanding or background. So you have to write it at a very basic level, not in a way that insults the reader, but you don't want to presuppose a body of knowledge. Writing for policymakers is different because, first of all, policymakers themselves are quite diverse. So, like, who is your audience? Well, it could be a policy advisor to a minister, member of parliament, MPP, mayor, that kind of thing. So it could be a policy wonk. It could be a communications advisor, so people to a minister or MP. So the kinds of people who don't necessarily understand policy, but have to sort of communicate it at a retail level at the door to voters. Ideally, you'd like the minister or member of parliament themselves to read it. But as well, you also have civil servants, so people inside the bureaucracy, so policy analysts and those sorts of people. And then often, if these are the types of documents that are also going public, and most of them are, you're also writing for other policy wonks in think tanks, industry, academia, that kind of thing. Well, if you throw those all together, throw them all into a blender, you're going to see where this gets problematic, because some of these policymakers, particularly the civil servants, the policy analysts, are already going to have a deep understanding of the issue. And you need to speak to them because they're going to be the ones having to sort of implement these ideas and analyze them and so on. But on the other hand, and I don't tend to insult anyone, but you're also writing for the 23-year-old communications graduate in a minister's office who is incredibly bright but has no background whatsoever. So the writing has to be useful, has to be accessible to everyone on that spectrum, and that makes it challenging. It makes it fun and rewarding, but it makes it challenging. Now, the second thing you need to understand about policymakers is there's far more relevant material to read than you could ever possibly have time for. And again, I say this as someone who advised a deputy minister. I would only read maybe 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10 things that crossed my desk. And that wasn't because I wasn't interested. It's just that there were only 8 hours in the day, and I could only spend some of those hours reading policy material, right? And then it's more challenging on top of that, because the goal of writing for policymakers doesn't begin and end at having them read your material and that's it. You want them to share your material, and ideally you want them to act on that material. So, kind of think of this as a pyramid, that the first step is getting them to read it in the first place, which can be incredibly difficult at times. Then you need to share it, you need them to communicate it with each other, understand it, and then act on it. So you have to understand there's a lot of noise here. There's a lot of noise here that you need to cut through. So how do you do that? So I'm going to give you 9 tips, and I'm going to be very brief about this. And again, if we take those 2 challenges together, okay, first of all, we need to make the writing accessible to all readers, all likely readers, useful to them. We need them to actually read it, and we need them to remember it. So here's some tips. Here's my 9 tips on how to do that, again, from someone who's been on both sides of the aisle. So the first thing, and actually I think it's the thing that people most often get wrong, is they write policy. I would say they write policy for the sake of writing policy. So they're like, here's my paper on basic income, let's say, without any indication of why I should read that and what problem are you trying to solve, right? So if I'm writing a paper about, or I some paper crosses my desk about accelerated capital cost allowance, I might scan it. But the first question I'm going to ask is like, what problem are you trying to solve? Like, why should I care about this issue? So when you're writing policy material, don't write policy material for policy's sake. Don't be like, okay, well, accelerated capital cost is an interesting idea, or basic income, or this. Have a problem focus that you articulate and is front and center at everything. So instead of writing a piece about accelerated capital cost allowance, which you can do, but couch it in, some text and something that's saying Canadian firms lag behind global counterparts when it comes to the adoption of new technologies, which is harming Canada's productivity, right? Get very explicit in the beginning. Here's the problem you're trying to solve, why it's an important problem, then get into the policy. Because otherwise people are going to get in a page, 2 pages in and go like, I don't see why I should care about this. This doesn't, as a policymaker, this doesn't make my life any better. So that's number one. And I think that's the thing that is most often gotten wrong by policy writers. So if you take anything away from this, it's this point. Be very, very clear in your own mind, but also in your writing, what problem you're trying to solve. Secondly, as I mentioned, policymakers are incredibly busy. So the shorter a document is, the more likely it is to be read and remembered. So be concise as possible. Well, it's easy to say, but how do you actually do that? So step 3, in your document, put any technical details, or if at all possible, put any technical details in a technical appendix, because 95% of readers aren't going to care about your statistic methodology, where you got the data from, that kind of thing. So it doesn't need to be in the text, and allows you to shorten the text. Now that stuff is important, so you shouldn't get rid of it entirely. But think about having a technical appendix, maybe a technical supplement to the document, which could be a separate document. But in order to make your writing as concise as possible, get those technical details, unless they're absolutely necessary, get them out of the body of the main document. You probably don't, chances are you don't need them. And ideally, when possible, have multiple versions of the content, right? Because I said, okay, well, they're not going to need the technical details. But furthermore, not everybody is going to need the 10 or 15 or 20 page reports. And you're asking a lot to get busy policymakers to read 10 or 15 or 20 pages, particularly if they're not interested in it in the first place. So what I would suggest is, for any policy work that you do, have multiple versions of it. Have the 10 or 15 or 20 page report, which is detailed and gives all the nuance, but can you also turn that into a 2-page brief? Could you have a short blog post, an infographic? Could you explain this in a series of tweets? And those don't replace the report, but they're add-ons to the report. So have your material in different scales. So, I would recommend a report, a brief, a blog and article, an infographic, a video, a presentation and a webinar. Perhaps if you're also trying to talk to media. And speaking of media, I should indicate that on February 5th, we have another webinar, How to Write and Engage with Media. So if you're also working on a media outreach strategy, make sure to sign up for that webinar. It's on the Smart Prosperity website. But try to have all of these different forms. And it actually, oddly enough, you might think that, okay, well, if I have the 2-page brief or I have the blog and article, that's going to cannibalize from my report. Fewer people will read my report. But it's actually exactly the opposite, right? That what will happen is, if you have the tweet, the infographic, maybe the 2-page brief or the blog article that piques their interest, then maybe they'll read the final report, right? So, having something small that crosses their desk then gives them the incentive, or piques their interest and go, okay, I want to learn more about this. But if you just throw the 15 or 20 page report on their desk without sort of selling them why this is important to them, why they should care, they're probably not going to read it. So I would recommend as much as possible, think about having versions of all of these. And in particular, again, having worked in government, we love our 2-page briefs. So whenever possible, have a 2-pager about the larger report, around the issues of the larger report that are just sort of just the facts, ma'am. 5, avoid jargon whenever possible. Again, that's because you have readers of all different backgrounds and knowledge of an area. So try and speak in as plain a language as possible. I understand it's not always possible. There are some areas where you'll absolutely have to use a specific term or set of specific terms, and that's fine. What you need to do is provide definitions of those terms, ideally in a sidebar or somewhere where they're accessible, because again, that creates value add. And in fact, if your reader takes anything away from them, they've now learned what some important piece of terminology means. 6, add salience through the use of interesting examples or stories. And this is so your policymaker actually remembers and shares the document, right? Because again, it's not just enough to get them to read the document. You need to get them to recall the documents, share the document. The salience is important. So you can accomplish this through the use of interesting examples or stories. So here's an example from a past life that it was a report we were doing when I was working for a different think tank. And the report was all about updates that needed to be made to Ontario's hotel regulations because of the emergence of Airbnb and other sharing platforms. It was interesting enough. But one of the things we were trying to do in this report was motivate the reason for change and to illustrate how out of date the hotel regulations have gotten or were at the time, and still, frankly, I believe are. So what we did in the report is we said, well, look, in the province of Ontario at the time, and I still think this is the case, the regulation or the law that governs Airbnb, first of all, it's called the Innkeepers Act, this sort of old-time language. And as part of the Innkeepers Act, there's a clause in there that suggests that after X number of days, after so many days, that if a guest does not pay their hotel bill, what are the conditions that the hotel or innkeeper is allowed to take possession of the guest's horse? So we had this little story in there. And then for years afterwards, like policymakers would come up to me and they're like, yeah, I love that horse example. It made this issue salient to people because it was funny and they kind of laughed, and it made them remember, oh, wow, this is how out of date these regulations are. It talks about putting liens on horses. And again, policymakers remembered and understood that. So try and do that whenever possible. And again, I know this is going to be challenging because 10 minutes ago I told you to be concise, and now I'm telling you to add color. You need to do both. So you need to figure out how to add these salient, interesting examples, but do so in a very concise way so you're not adding significant length to the text. Finally, you should anticipate questions readers or your policymakers are likely to have and answer them in the document. Don't leave them, whenever possible, don't leave them unanswered, because a skeptical audience, and policymakers should be skeptical. If they're doing their job, they will be skeptical. These are the questions they're going to have, and if you don't address them, they're going to assume that the answer is not a good one. So try, as you're writing, go, okay, well, what questions are they going to ask? And can I address those questions in the text? Again, ideally in the 15-page version. You probably don't have time to do this in this 2-page version. But policymakers always ask, like, has this idea that you're advocating, has it been tried in other jurisdictions? If so, what was the experience? Are there any alternatives to this? So you're advocating for, accelerated capital cost allowance for clean tech. But is that the only option to get Canadian firms to adopt clean tech? Are there other things we should be considering? If so, why is your recommendation better than those other ones? Big one is distributional impacts. Policymakers care about, if you're advocating some policy, how does it affect men and women? How does it affect high income people, low income people? What are the relative effects? Does this aid or benefit or hinder, First Nation entrepreneurship? So these sort of gender-based analysis, GBA plus questions should at least be acknowledged in the text, even if you're not doing, and you're probably not doing a full GBA plus. And then finally, are there likely to be any unintended consequences if implemented? What are they? So in enacting this policy, is it going to affect something else, either positively or negatively, that you weren't really intending to? Does it have any spin-off benefits or potential spin-off costs or externalities? And 8, acknowledge the downside. If your policy document comes across as too cheerleading, going like, this is the greatest idea ever, and everything is glowing and positive, it's not that credible. So if there are issues with this, even if they're small issues, address them and acknowledge them. And in fact, it makes, you'll actually get increased uptake for your ideas, because your ideas will sound more credible. If you say, okay, here are the 8 benefits of this policy, but here are the 2 or 3 drawbacks. It's expensive or politically unpopular or hard to explain to people. Acknowledge that, because you'll actually get more traction from that if it looks like, and if you genuinely are providing a balanced account. 9, have a strong, concise summary. All right, so to maximize the chances that your work is read. So I'm gonna, this is my strong, concise summary to this webinar. To maximize the chances your policy writing is read, shared, and understood, multiple versions of different sizes of the document, make them jargon-free, have a hook, a story, a narrative that people will remember, and most importantly, answer that so what question. Answer that question of what problem are you trying to solve? So that's it. I hope I followed my own advice, made this concise, and made this jargon-free. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And again, our next webinar is on February 5th, how to write and engage with the media. So thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.